What is womanist theology, and how does it differ from feminist theology?
Well, it's a sort of long and winding short road. In the 70s, when I started doing theological studies, and in general, we used the term black feminist. And that was, even in that, it was a sort of critique of white feminism, because it was in that era, they were leaving out women of all kinds of darker skin. Lesbians weren't included. Working class or poor women weren't included. It was really sort of a middle class phenomenon. So many of us used the phrase black feminist to describe what we were about, because we wanted to be clear that we understood gender oppression, but it was not in isolation. Race and class in that period were also important for us, given the communities we were coming out of. Alice Walker, the writer, wrote in 1983 or 84. She published her book of essays, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And then there's the infamous colon, Womanist Prose. And her editor said, "What's that?" And she sat down and said, "Okay, I'll tell you," and came up with a 4-part definition. And what Walker was trying to do was find a word that was a part of black speak. And she's being a Southerner, black speech in the South. So womanish, little black girls were often called womanish when you asked too many questions adults couldn't answer, or you had to grow up much faster than most other girls did because of race and rape, and had to contend with images of beauty and whatnot. And so part of, and the last definition of her 4th one is, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. And that was a direct critique of white feminism, not being deep enough, rich enough, thorough enough, expansive enough. Well, a group of black women at Union Seminary in New York saw this, and they built a cohort there of both PhD students and students training for ministry. And they said, let's see if we can use this word to talk about what we do. And womanist thought in womanist theology, womanist ethics, womanist history took off and running as folks tried then to integrate a race, gender, and class analysis into their work as theologians or historians or ethicists or pastoral care and counseling, you name it. And that is the key difference. And also, you will more often see women related to Christian communities using the term womanist rather than black feminist now.
You said race, gender, and class, but you're black, you're a woman, and you're gay, you have a wife. So does that definition of womanist need expanding? Or do you need a new term?
No, it's, the great thing about womanist is that it's not a discipline. For me, it's a methodology. So if you are wise, you're always fine-tuning your methodology. So when I talk about it now, in 2017, I will say race, gender, class, sex and sexuality, militarism, ageism, and a few other things. Because part of the thrust of it is to understand that oppressions work in a matrix. And to only pick out one is probably not going to do much good.
In many ways, your most famous book was Womanist Ethics and the Cultural Production of Evil, and in that you talk about structural evil. And can you just explain a little bit more about what structural evil is and the way you see it manifesting today in America?
That book, I thought I was writing a simple book. I don't know why I thought a book on evil would be simple, but I did. And it turned out not to be very simple at all. What I was trying to understand is why is it so many ethicists through the centuries have talked about evil and tried to say we shouldn't do it, and we haven't made much of a dent. What are we missing? What are we missing? So I actually decided to turn to writers to see what they had to say about evil, to see if I could understand what I was missing as an ethicist. And what I came to was a realization that evil is not just held in place by structures like poverty, but it's also held in place by what we do in the imagination, how our imaginations function. And so I coined the phrase fantastic hegemonic imagination to really just say that this is something that escapes no one in our culture at all. And that we create caricatures of one another without trying to learn who we are as people, as individuals, as groups. And then we think those caricatures are true. And then if we speak them long enough, they become true. And then we have now condemned ourselves to dealing with fantasies of each other rather than flesh and blood. So structural evil then is based on a sense of that kind of head trip we place on ourselves, all of us, and then the ways that we find ways to hold that fantasy in place. And so we come up with lots of stereotypes, caricatures.
You say that context is vital and there's no such thing as universal knowledge, but isn't that a problem in this climate? We've never seen a whiter and more male administration, especially the cabinet, in decades. So I'm wondering what that tells you and what hope there is for change.
That tells me that inept analysis came up with silly words like post-racial, simply because we elected a black man as president without examining our attitudes. And that we're now having, in many ways, a sort of wake-up call for many folks who thought it was easy to get rid of decades and hundreds of years of various forms of hatred, various forms of denial, and also amnesia about how this country was founded, the principles that helped that happen, and the ways in which we have often disrespected whole groups of people simply because they didn't look like us. So I was not surprised that our current president was elected at all. In fact, I expected it. And that could be me being a grumpy social ethicist who's sometimes pessimistic. But I think in this case, I was trying to be realistic, that we needed to be ready to really, really engage in serious acts of belief and not just sort of talk about it. So I take heart in the fact that there's a gospel song that goes something to the effect, we get knocked down and we get back up. And that's what we have to do. Evil doesn't just walk out the door. You have to chase it out and you have to chase it down the road. And if you can, you eradicate it. And I think this kind of administration that we're seeing unfold is a poster child for the kinds of ways that we have disrespected others. And now it has some control, although the latest defeat on healthcare might indicate that even that administration is not in control. And I think that's a scary thought for all of us, frankly.
But coming back to universal knowledge and objective truth, which you've got a lot to say about, is your idea that there is no universal knowledge not a problem in this climate when our president is undermining the very notion of what is true?
Knowledge and truth are two different things. The truth, and there's a wonderful book by Patrick Chamizo, and I'm blanking on the title now, but Google it, and it'll be his most Googled, most cited book. in which he talks about the true and the true. And it's coming out of a sense of the way one can play with the understanding of truth and how that moves in and out of reality. I think what we're seeing now with the post-election, post-modern, post-truth crap is really a hijacking of the common good and a massive hijacking of the common good. This is not about knowledge. This is about people manipulating what we can see and what we feel, and in certain cases say you're not seeing or thinking what you're seeing and thinking. Here's what's really going on, and there are those who will buy into that. Knowledge, on the other hand, is what happens when you learn once. Don't put your hand in an open flame. You know that now, and that's something that you can employ on a daily basis. Knowledge is something that's akin to me wisdom. It's a thing you do when you're about to do a thing that you've never done before, but you do it. It's a somewhat of an intangible because it's not even smart. It's a way of knowing that gets us to the heart and soul of our being, the heart and soul of our isness, the people who we are.
So for you, scholarship cannot just be abstract. It has to be engaged. Scholars have to be activists, even theologians.
Absolutely. Yeah, even theologians, especially theologians, and bring the philosophers too. No, I think it's true that knowledge, scholarship, teaching are not neutral activities. I think that part of what we strive for, we say, is objectivity, but I think that's an exceedingly elusive thing. I think we all bring to our work, to our classrooms, to our lectures, a certain bias. We're raised in schools of thought as scholars. You know, if you talk to people long enough, you can figure out where they went to school. That's a bias. That's not objective thought. That's a way of being trained into a way of thinking. All I'm saying is acknowledge it and use it to the better. Use it for the common good. Use it to change the world in ways that become more humane, more just, more loving. This is where my deep formation in Black religious circles comes out, where you don't just love God to love God, you love God in order to learn how to better love humanity. And so it's not a possession, it's a gift. And that's what we should be doing, I think, with each other in the academy. What is the gift I have to bring to this problem, this idea? And how can I get into the mix with that? And then how can we take that somewhat esoteric and sometimes arcane activity and present it in such a way that people have aha moments about their lives and then try to live differently, hopefully for the better.
You're speaking as a progressive.
Yes.
Does this equally apply, do you think, to scholars who are more conservative in their political outlooks? You want them to be out there engaged in activism
as
too?
much as I hate to say it, yes. Because I don't think we are well served singing only one note. Creation is far too vast. The possibilities are far too great. And even in my own work, when I'm working on a topic, I read from the most conservative folks I can find to the most radical. And then I lay it all out and think, now where am I in the midst of this? So it's not for the lazy at all.
But what does religious discourse have to bring to this polarized world?
Yeah, we talk about values a lot. And there's a way in which there are different parts of the university that talk about values, and they do it all the time, and they do it well. But when you add moral values to it, that sense of what should we be doing as agents in the world, how should we do it as we do it, and what does it mean to be responsive to how people are making meaning in their lives, and help them think through, what are the categories to think about when you're doing that. That, for me, is the thing that religion does, sometimes in some very compelling ways, sometimes in some very messy ways. But the idea is to move forward, move the country, the world, the university, wherever we are, forward in an unambiguous way. I think of, we were recently doing our initial runs for the Capitol campaign. All the deans got together, and we each did a little dog and pony show. And we did it alphabetically by last name, so I was near the end of the morning, long morning. And I realized that I started talking about justice and purpose and meaning and transformation. And everybody in the room was just sort of looking at me. They sort of did the puppy dog roll. Like, oh, this is what religion does. It does call out some higher values in us. And we don't do it shamefacedly. You just get in there and say, it matters. Life matters. All lives matter. And name those who really aren't.
You write that unexplored religious values shape public policy. What are those religious values in the US? And I'm thinking very much in terms of what you've written about Protestantism and a particular brand of Protestantism that many of us have really just encountered as it becomes more obvious in politics in the shape of the religious right.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the values is this notion of frugality. Womanist ethicist Katie Cannon was just pivotal when she pointed out in her first book that, and she made a distinction between dominant ethics and ethics. And dominant ethics is built on a range of choices, frugality, and all these, just a whole long list of things. She said, what happens when you're in a community where those aren't virtues? Those are actually necessities of survival. So for me, it's really trying to get at those sorts of things. The notion of an inept notion of Calvin, and how we are supposed to pull ourselves up by our own bootstraps, and if we don't, that's our fault. Well, he also said, and if you have more, you give more. We always leave that out in public policy. Somehow that never gets mentioned. It's the bootstrap stuff. So those sorts of things that are sort of winding their way, this sense of autonomy. We're the autonomous selves, masters and mistresses of our own fate. Without realizing that's not what particularly Protestant Christianity is all about. We're supposed to be building communities of people. What happens when we don't remember, or may have never known because we were not taught, that community is something that's fostered in religious communities, particularly Protestant Christianity? Mm-hmm. So it's also not knowing some things religiously that get us into trouble in public policy, because we, we very easily drop things out when it's either not our problem, or we think it's their problem. Mm-hmm. And they should be disciplined. That's a mean religion.
And yet, Protestant Christianity's emphasis on autonomy brought about a sense of individual morality and responsibility, which those on the right would say is very important.
It is very important, but let's not go crazy about it. I mean, let's not carry it to an excess such that we don't even know how to form diverse communities. I think so often when you get yourself in the cycle of the strong, autonomous, moral self, what happens is we forget we need others. And we have used others, even if we think we have done it all by ourselves. That's not true. We can't get through life without a little help from other people. What better people might we be if we could get some folks who don't really think like us, look like us, act like us, to give us another perspective of how to live our lives. And then, put that in the mix as well. So it's not that I'm so anti-strong moral self. It's the kind of rampant individualism that I am opposed to, that leaves far too many people out.
What about identity politics? Many would say the Democrats lost this election because they got sidetracked into identity politics. It's gone too far. They forgot the working poor, for instance.
Well, frankly, I think everybody forgets the working poor until it's easy. They become an easy group or demographic to point to or to mobilize for our own purposes. Identity politics, I think it's in the eye of the beholder. I don't know any politics in this country that isn't some form of identity politics. Even if it's someone in elite white male, uber rich, they function out of their own ends, their own desires, their own ability to see and inability to see. So that to me becomes a sort of far too facile whipping post for just not getting our homework done on what it takes to live with each other.
You've said that citizens need to get involved in institutions. Of course, many have lost faith, have lost trust in institutions. Do you now see this engagement happening in, for instance, the grassroots movement emerging against Donald Trump?
I think so, and it's interesting. I've been following Black Lives Matter, and it's different all over the country, and that's one thing that was not being addressed at all by most media. They try to lump it into one thing, and that's not what's going on in Nashville. Several of the alums and current members of the Divinity School were founders of Black Lives Matter. They're not opposed to religion. They're critical of religion, but they're not opposed to it. Other places in the country, those members don't have anything to do with the church because they think it's sold out, particularly the black church. But what I'm learning from Black Lives Matter and its diversity is that they have developed a model that people in my generation don't understand, and it's decentralized. It's not one person, it's not built on the charisma of one or two or three. It's built on the talents of everyone. And I'm sort of curious to see how they're going to hold that together over time. Because the models we have around institutions is they're sort of centered around a core, whether it's a person or a group. But in their effort to not be institutional, they become institutional. So how do we, what's going to happen?
The routinization problem.
Right. I don't know what's going to happen with them, but I have a lot of hope when I look at those groups. The different Lives Matters groups. This is just not just Black Lives Matter. And I think they issue some well-deserved criticism of some organizations, some institutions that have become fat and happy, as opposed to really being engaged in the world and who they say they're engaging. So you get to a certain place and you just sit and you look around and you get real happy and you don't do much. Well,
would you include black churches in that?
Oh, yes.
You're an ordained Baptist minister, of course,
Yeah.
but I've heard this criticism widely that by members of Black Lives Matter that the church has been passive, and by the way, it was passive during the civil rights era. We just over kind of emphasize its role because of Martin Luther King.
Well, what we didn't emphasize enough was the power of the laity, and particularly black women in the civil rights movement. That was a moment of sexism. And it was the laity, and it was predominantly black women who were on the front line in the civil rights movement. They're the ones that got their pastors out there after their pastors realized that they needed to run around from the back and get in the front, because these women were moving and making change and doing that. So there's always that sense of we don't always know our own history fully. There's that piece. But yes, I talk to our black students a lot. And one of the things they say quite consistently is, I want to be in ministry, but I don't want to be like, and they point to someone they know. And say, no, I want to be somebody who's really in there with the people and helping and making change. And I just sort of encourage them, pump them up. Yeah, do that, do that. Don't tell them you talk to me, but do that, do that. Because you've got to own it yourself. Everybody's got a different strategy, a different way of being, that prophetic voice. And that's what they're yearning for, that sense of returning the prophetic back into black churches.
You're a glass ceiling breaker. First African-American woman president of the American Academy of Religion, first African-American woman dean of the Divinity School at Vanderbilt. But apart from being a scholar, you're also an ordained Baptist minister. So in many ways, you're called to prophetic work, right? And again, I guess I would come back to the idea of scholar as activist. Can you bring scholars along with you? And are you hopeful for the future that that glass ceiling has shattered?
Well, we keep chipping at it with our knives, our ice picks some days, it feels like. I would not be here if I did not have a community of people who believed in the power of education as activism. I was raised that way. Some of my most powerful mentors who've now since died modeled it in their own way of being in the classroom, their own scholarship, the ways they organized groups, the groups they got involved in, and how they got involved in. I was a little kid who watched a lot. And as I got older, I watched some more just to see, how is this done? And so I know I'm not alone. And I know that I have been placed in some opportunities where my responsibility is not to sort of sit on the pedestal and glorying and be there, but it's to reach down. It's to model the black club movements, black women's club movement saying, lifting as we climb, that you don't do it by yourself. You do it so you can open the door wider and wider and wider and wider for more people to come in. And if the place you're coming in is a little decrepit and a little evil and a little wretched, you clean up the house. You don't just get there and continue to produce the same sort of wickedness that caused that ceiling to be put in place. But you try to do it differently. You try to do it with the kind of sense of moral courage, or another phrase I use now more and more is colored orneriness, that it's not enough to just get someplace. You have to look, for me at least, I have to look around and say, what can I do to make this place better so that I can welcome more people here as we're all cleaning it up together. So I'm hopeful, yes. I see it in the eyes of some of my doctoral students who are now no longer students. They are professors, the oldest of which now is full professor and in chairs and all manner of things. And I also see it in the master students and the kinds of churches and the kinds of community-based agencies they're creating. So yeah, I believe that it's possible. I believe that it happens, but one cannot get complacent. You cannot get satisfied. And I think that's one of the things that a womanist methodology teaches me. You always have to be looking at it to make sure you're really staying on point. You're still on that edge of creativity, recognizing where tradition belongs, but also looking to the future.
Professor Emilie Townes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.